What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another modern video, and today we're going to be taking a look at the other Cascade deck that is in the modern format that is a little bit more boom or bust, I would say, than its counterpart. So today we're going to take a look at Living End for the modern format and kind of check out and see if there's anything new that it's doing to kind of warrant the uptick in the metagame share that it seemed to have gotten here in like the last about month or two. But before we get too deep into that, of course, if you are not already subscribed to the channel and you are watching this, of course, please consider subscribing and ring the notification bell as well so you know when videos get posted. And on top of that, there's two links in the description of this video. One of them goes to my Twitch channel. Go ahead and follow me over on Twitch so you know when I go live, playing Magic, any other video games and stuff like that. And of course, there's a link to the Discord server as well. Go ahead, follow that, and feel free to join as well. So, Living End for the uninitiated is a deck that abuses one of the two, essentially, most played suspend cards in the format. So we have Crashing Footfalls, that makes 4/4 Rhinos, and Living End that allows us to bring creatures back from our graveyard. So officially, Living End says that you can that each player exiles all creature cards from their graveyards, then sacrifices all the creatures they control, and then puts all the cards they exiled this way onto the battlefield. So this gets around like Grafdigger's Cage and things like that that stop creatures from entering from the graveyard. The creatures technically enter from exile. The creatures just end up getting exiled from the graveyard, you know. So uh, this card is supposed to be like pay 4 mana to spend 3, and then allow everyone time to kind of like set up to potentially do it. But of course, in a format like Modern, that is not happening. So just like in the Rhinos decks, you have a 4 Shardless Agent, which is a 3 mana 2/2 that cascades to hit something that costs 2 or less, and Violent Outburst, giving your creatures +1/+0 for a green, a red, and 1 that also has Cascade. And of course, the only card that costs less than them is Living End in your deck, which this one is actually playing 4. Historically, most Living End decks have played 3, but this one in particular that did very well in the Modern Challenge this past weekend only played all 4, which I think is like super reasonable. So this deck, in theory, should be more consistent than a lot of like the other combo decks per se, because you're essentially looking for like 1 or 2 lands and then a bunch of cyclers. You have Street Wraith that cycles for free. You have like Sky Turtle, which doesn't necessarily cycle, but it does give you some utility, like getting cards back from your graveyard to your hand. Maybe if like you played a Cascade spell and your opponent counters it, whatever, the Sky Turtle can pick it up, and then it also goes into your graveyard, which can be Living Ended back later. You have like Wakero Waves that doesn't necessarily cycle, but it will let you look deeper. So like you discard the Wakero Waves, so you already get the 7/7 in your graveyard. Then you look at 2 cards, you put one in your hand, the other into your graveyard. Obviously, the upside of it would be to put another creature into your graveyard while also maybe adding another cycling creature, or obviously a card that you might be missing, which might be like a Cascader, your 3rd land, or so on. Just very good at letting you dig deep, and of course forwarding that game plan of putting things into the graveyard. Grief playing like the same role as like Unmask would play in like the Legacy format, but a little bit more of a benefit because it does give you something to do with like the living ends that are stuck in your hand, because you obviously don't want to suspend them. You want to be casting them essentially for free and like on turn 3 of the game. So grief is like a way of getting this into the graveyard. You can evoke it, take your best card out of your opponent's hand, maybe stop like a counter spell, things like that, and get it into the graveyard, and then when you get it back later, take maybe your opponent's answer to your whole board of big idiots that just really don't do a whole lot, are like relatively like okay, like on their rate. Some other cards, like you have Force of Negation, is like a way that you can fight over this, like on your opponent's turn. You go for an end step Violent Outburst. You can leave up Force of Negation, to fight through at least a few pieces of interaction. And of course, like if they're able to beat the Force of Negation, they're gonna have to have more for the Shardless Agent, which is a lot for a deck to have like on like the 3rd turn of the game. So it's definitely entirely possible to just have like two Cascaders, cycle a bunch of cards, get a bunch of creatures in the graveyard, what have you, and then fight over a violent outburst on like your opponent's turn, so then you can just set up for a Shardless Agent on your turn. And again, with like all the cycling and stuff that's in the deck, you're going to draw a bunch of cards while also feeding into this game plan of, getting to living end a whole board of things back. This deck in particular has a very good matchup historically, like in game ones, just because your opponents really don't have a lot of like main deck hate per se. Endurance is probably the most main deckable graveyard hate card that is available in the format, and it's probably the best one just because it gets rid of the whole graveyard. But obviously, on top of that, like you do just end up drawing a ton of cyclers. So if your opponent gets you where like you play like a living end and your opponent is able to put your graveyard back into your library. It does kind of suck, but you have more living ends to kind of like try to go off and do it again. And as long as your opponent doesn't really put a fast clock on you, this deck can rebuild after getting its own graveyard like endurance and stuff like that. So definitely not a deck where you can stop them from doing the thing once and then like you're pretty okay to like dirtle around and take your time cobbling together a win. It's like if you stop it, like you need to be winning within like the next like few turns, or else it's just the same thing is going to happen. Except you'll be infinitely more sad because you still don't have anything in your graveyard and they're gonna be bringing back all the things. uh, the mana base, super, I would say like pretty simple for the most part. Obviously, it's not playing any of the triomes, and that's because like in the Rhinos version, like if you need to suspend it, Crashing Footfalls, you do have the option, which is definitely the far superior deck to be able to suspend the thing that you're trying to cheat into play. But with this deck, you don't need necessarily the mana fixing, even though you still play like basically the Teamer colors. You don't want it because you want as many lands that will come into play untapped on the first few turns of the game, so you can just continue to cycle through your creatures. Eventually, get to like Waker Waves and Colossal Sky Turtle and things of that nature to obviously get them into the graveyard. So you have Beseiju is a little bit of interaction with your lands that you are not going to hit with your Cascade spells. Brazen Borrower kind of filling the same role as just being like some cheap interaction that is not going to get hit by your Cascade. You see that there's like Botanical Sanctum and Spire Bluff Canals, which are the fast lands that are going to come to play untapped unless you control two or fewer other lands, which essentially means on your third turn, if it's your third land, it's going to come into play untapped. Definitely not dealing a lot of damage to yourself is going to help you in those games where you end up getting your graveyard shuffled away or they fizzle like your first living end. It'll definitely buffer your life total a little bit so that you can hopefully get another turn or two, so then you can then attempt to do it all over again and force your opponent to again have more interaction. You have Sunken Ruins, because sometimes you just want to actually cast like Grief, Street Wraith, Architect of Wills, all these things. Like eventually you will be able to cast them. And while they're not like super flashy, whatever, playing a 7 mana like 5/5 with Hexproof is pretty hard to deal with in the format, especially knowing like what creatures are like the best creatures to be playing in the format. Like Riverwinder just kind of blanks them for the most part. But Sunken Ruin allows you to do that without further like compromising the mana base. You have like Misty Rainforest, you have like two Scalding Tarns, you have that is it because of the other list is what I'm thinking of. But you have like Otawara, you have Breeding Pools, you have Steam Vents. All these lands just come into play untapped. You have your basics, of course, for like the Blood Moons and stuff, but a lot of these lands just get you lands that enter the battlefield untapped. Don't really cost you a lot of life. Obviously, if you go fetch shock, that's 3 damage, but just getting to fetch for like a basic or anything like that, and these being like the more important ones, does open up the door for you to keep that life total high so you don't just get aggroed out of a game. Of course, the sideboards get a little tricky in these Cascade decks because you have to kind of get creative. In this one, I mean, playing all 2 ofs and like a 3 of is pretty neat. So you have like Endurance to kind of mess with like other players' graveyards. The Just Guy create, not Just Guy creativity, like the Jeskai, like Ragavan decks and stuff like that. Just getting to mess with like their DRCs, plus getting to ambush one is pretty good. On top of also just getting to get rid of your opponent's graveyard on the turns that you living end if you have to living end a second time. You have mystical disputes as like ways to interact with like the blue decks, Force of Vigor and like Foundation Breaker to deal with any of the like artifact and enchantment based like graveyard hates, where there's still people that are playing like some amounts like Leyline of the Void. You have people that are playing like Grafdigger, well, not even like Grafdigger's Cage, but I'm sure people will try to do that as well. Just any annoying pieces that could like interact with your graveyard that are not endurance, Force of Vigor and Foundation Breaker will deal with nicely. Of course, with Foundation Breaker having the added bonus of getting to come back if you evoke it. Leyline of Sanctity giving you hexproof to just deal with like any of the other like burn. Leyline of Sanctity is usually pretty good against them, against opposing endurances and things like that. Meaning like you can't be targeted with the endurance effect, which is really nice. Leyline of Void, just some more ways of messing with the graveyard, kind of the same way that like you have endurance. Subtlety is like another way that you can interact with like endurance and other creatures and stuff that'll kind of mess with the graveyard, maybe mess with like how your cascade spells work and things like that. So that is the living in deck for modern. Really not much changing. Like the sideboard kind of gets tuned a little bit more. The main deck I think is a pretty set in stone for the most part, except maybe like you could probably get away with changing some of these numbers as well to maybe combat, may have a little extra against some of the other like annoying matchups and things like that. But for the most part, Living End is a deck that doesn't really get a whole lot of new things. It stays relatively unchanged for the fact that you either need like really good cycling creatures that come into play. Like you have Curator Mysteries, which is like I think the newest like cycling card that actually has cycling printed on it. But then you have cards like Waker of Waves that find their way in the graveyard, things like that. Definitely a deck where you are going to be have to be willing to keep a lot of like one land hands that just have like a ton of cyclers, because obviously getting to draw like 4 or 5 cards before you play your second turn is you're very likely to find a second land, which hopefully means that you're able to find a third land, stuff like that. Also know that you are definitely 100% the bad guy. Anyone playing Cascade is the bad guy, and of the villains, you're kind of like the bane of the villains, where like the Rhinos player is kind of like some like one-off like B tier villain. Like they're technically evil, but like it's kind of like a cute evil. Living End, you're just like super evil. Like not necessarily the Joker, but you're pretty bad. So that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below if there's a modern deck that you want to see in the future. Of course, consider following me on Twitch as well with the link in the description of the video, along with, excuse me, the link to the Discord server as well. So that's going to do it for me. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video.